Hello, this is Derek Johnson. I'm with SAP. I'm a product manager for SAP Analytics Cloud, focusing on planning topics. I'd like to welcome you to our second unit, which is going to focus on modeling. So if you've attended the entire SAP or Open SAP course thus far, you should have already been exposed to analytical models. The good news is that looking at a planning model is very similar to an analytical model, and there shouldn't be really much difference between the two from being able to create an analytical model versus a planning. But I want you to be aware of maybe some of the differences between the two, in particular some of the features that we have that are available, that may be available for an analytical model perspective, but are especially useful for planning. So from a planning perspective, one of the key things that we always include in a planning model is time. So that's absolutely required, so it's not required as part of an analytical model. The other thing that you'll see is that we'll have category inversions as well. So category is a broad way of defining our versions. So we have like actual, budget, forecast, rolling forecast, and kind of different planning categories that we may have. And then we have the specific versions as well. So you can have a January forecast, a February forecast, March forecast, and the like. So really you're not limited to the number of versions that you can create in your planning model. I know sometimes that gets asked, but you can create as many as you'd like, and you can give it very descriptive names. The category just allows you to kind of visually see what type of plan it is in a report and some of the visualizations as well. So from a planning perspective, we have very some of the key features here is that we have the ability to define in the account dimension what the account type is, and this is really critical for handling signage. So if you have an income and expense, it'll handle the assigns appropriately there as well as a balance sheet accounts as well, so your liabilities and assets. So depending on what you're looking at, you can tag the account type, and then it'll handle the signage correctly in a report. So if you're not familiar with financial planning, a lot of times revenue is stored as a negative number, but if you are looking in a report, you typically want to see that as a positive number. So it's really the account type as part of the account dimension, so it's a critical role. In addition to that, we can also specify what type of currency translation we would like to perform, and that's a rate type. So we have average and closing. So an average rate is typically used for P&L type accounts, and we have a closing account, which is typically for balance sheet accounts. So this really ties in nicely with our currency conversion. So we can create a model specifically for currency conversion, and we can load that information either directly by copy paste or loading it from a system that we may be storing that type of currency information. So there's a lot of flexibility there as well. Some other key things, of course, is the authorizations. We can do that within the model, where we can grant read and write access to specific nodes in the model. So you may have a case where you'd like someone to plan on a very specific node, maybe by country, but then you want them to be able to read information from a continent perspective. So it's a little bit different, that we have the ability to control not just what data someone has access to from a read perspective, but also control the access from a write perspective as well. And lastly, we have the ability to put in data locking as part of our model definition as well. And this is absolutely critical for planning. So if you are in the middle of planning, say sales by region, and you've gone through the approval process for doing your sales updates, then you can start to use data locking that's as part of the model definition to lock other users from making change to that particular region of data. So it's very helpful and critical, and that's really some of the differences between the planning as well as an analytical model. Another key feature that we use quite extensively in planning models is the ability to control aggregation and in dimension formulas. So we'll take a look at dimension formulas here. So on our account dimension, as part of the model definition, we can create calculations. And this is pretty exciting because we can start to do conditional logic, if then, and we can start bringing in attributes of our dimensions to do comparisons. So if a product is equal to a certain product group, we may do a certain calculation. If it's not equal to that, we can do a different type of calculation as well. So there's a lot of flexibility. The nice thing about our dimension formulas is that the calculation is executed in real time. So if you change the definition within the model between running a report, you'll see that change in the value reflected as a real-time calculation. And this is going to be a little bit different than when we look at data actions, which actually calculate and then store the value. So some of the things that we can do within our dimension formulas is that we can do lookups to your model if you're looking at other accounts, for instance, to grab data. So this may be as simple as looking up prices. If we're doing some sort of price or some sort of revenue calculation for sales times units equal a revenue, we can look up price information. We can look up number of units depending on how we've staged our data. That's useful for driver-based calculations as well. In addition to that, we can use attributes. I think we discussed that already. We can do links, so we can pull data from other models if we need to as well. So that's also a real-time calculation. So if you need to grab a value that's stored in another model, maybe it could be a sales planning model, it could be a workforce planning model, really any type of model to support your overall story, you can bring that in as well using link formulas. And there's a number of formulas that are keywords that are defined, and certainly would encourage you to look them up as well in the help documentation. But really my favorite method for using these dimension formulas is really for creating KPI type calculations. So if you need to know sales per head count, for example, it's very easy to create that formula and have that calculation occur in real time. And we'll have a number of these calculations that we'll include as part of the exercise. In addition to that, we also have the ability to add inverse formulas as part of a calculation. So if we're looking at something like operating margin, because it's a calculation, typically we cannot plan on that. But if we include an inverse formula, what it allows us to do is actually plan on something like operating margin, and then we can tell it what we'd like to adjust as part of that definition within the formula. And the good news is we're going to have an example of that in the exercise as well. So in addition to that, we have exception aggregation, and this is really a way to kind of add some additional analytics into your data as well. And so some of the key things that we can do is do like counts, min, max, averages, summations. No standard deviation in this case, but you can certainly see that there's a number of very analytical ways for you as a planner to look at your data and get some insights based on these exception aggregations and really kind of get a better handle on what holistically is happening in your data and in your various planning scenarios. And certainly would encourage you to take advantage of these as well. And we'll include some examples of this and how to use that in this part of the exercise as well. And probably the most interesting one of the exception aggregations is really the summation, and that's super useful if we're trying to do calculations like revenue equals sales times volume, where we can use the exception aggregation of summation, and then we can set our dimensions to say at what level we would like this calculation to occur. So definitely keep your eye open. There's a lot of great uses for exception aggregation to really make your data analysis much simpler using SAP Analytics Cloud. Another key component, and I think we've discussed this as well, certainly as we set properties in the account dimension to handle or specify how we'd like to handle our currency translation, we can also have currency models as well. And this is where we can store rates. So we can store rates by different categories, and we can include custom rates as well. So this will really help you if you want to do any type of currency analysis within SAP Analytics Cloud. And these rates can be loaded from a transactional system, such as an ECC system or BPC, or it could just be copied and pasted if you're just doing something quick and dirty for some currency analysis. Data locking, this is great functionality in terms of planning, of being able to lock down parts of your plan once you got approvals, and this prevents people from making additional changes. So you can't specify someone as being responsible, and they can kind of override that lock as needed, but for the most part, the locking is intended to kind of start to lock down the plan, prevent people from making changes, so that you can kind of slowly get the entire plan approved and not changed. So ideally it would be locked holistically at the end of your planning cycle, and then you could kind of move forward. So this is just a great way to kind of protect your work as a planner and keep people from continually making changes to your plan and have to go through an endless cycle of review cycles. So this is really meant to kind of simplify the overall planning process. And although we do not have an exercise specifically on data locking, feel free to explore this as well. There's certainly some good videos and help and documentation as well that should help guide you and how you could set this up if you'd like. One of the things that you should be aware of, though, is that as a person that creates the model, you are an owner of the model, so you can overwrite a lot of these data locking type scenarios as well, because you're kind of the admin for the model. So that's really what makes it a little bit trickier to test as part of creating an exercise. Security, there's really two basic ways we can do security. So we can certainly do role-based security, and that is setting up a role, and then we can go through the process of defining what we'd like people to have access to. This is very similar to business intelligence, and when we create analytical models, one of the things that's a little bit different is that we can enable the data access control within the model, and then we can set read and write within a dimension itself. So when we set this property and say what dimensions we'd like to secure, we'll have two additional columns that get added for read and write access. And then we can specify individuals or teams to these nodes, and that'll provide data access to various team members for accessing the model going forward. So you don't have to set read and write at the same levels. Typically, the read access is a little bit more generously granted, but if you want to control who has access to write to a particular node or area or region, you would control that. You can control that in a similar way as well. We're going to have a click-through demo on a BPC integration scenario. There's certainly some great videos and help that go through the steps to create this integration as well. Really what I wanted to cover here was what some of the differences between some of the options that you may see, because it can be a little bit confusing on first review. So from a BPC perspective, we really have two really basic flavors. We have the standard model and we have the embedded model. And so for this, we're really talking about the 10.x and above. But I just want to kind of take the standard model first. So we have two different ways that we connect to the standard model. One is through a near live connection, and one is through data acquisition. So from a data acquisition perspective, we can connect BPC to a BPC standard model in this case, and we can go through a wizard to create our model. So we get to select our dimensions that we'd like to bring over, and we can do any kind of filtering as well. The data will be brought over and physically stored within SAP Analytics Cloud, and it's really going to be treated as its own planning model in this case. And with that, we can start to add dimensions into the model. So if we want to have different dimensionality or extend the dimensionality, we can do that within SAP Analytics Cloud. In addition to that, we could also add members within SAP Analytics Cloud as well. So all the capabilities of planning will be available to the user, and then they can plan to their heart's content. If you want to transfer that data back into a BPC environment, there's some export capabilities as well, where we can write this data back to BPC, and that would be in a batch job. In addition to that, we have the near live scenario as well. So this is a case where we want our standard model within BPC and our standard model within SAP to be tightly linked. And in this case, we're going to have, when we go through the model build process, the dimensionality and members will be identical between the two model sets. So essentially BPC will be kind of driving the dimensionality and the members as well. So there'll be a one-to-one relationship. We can start to plan within SAP Analytics Cloud. We have a lot of the, because we're still acquiring the data within SAP Analytics Cloud, we have full access to all the planning functionality within SAP Analytics Cloud, and we can plan to our heart's content. The difference is that instead of using a batch job to write the data back from SAC to BPC in this case, we can simply go to version management and then publish it back to BPC. And when we do that, it's going to write the data back into BPC, and then it'll execute default logic in BPC in this case, and then it'll resynchronize the data between BPC and SAC again. So it kind of refreshes the data so you get the latest view. So this is a great way to kind of extend your planning scenario, especially if you own BPC already. The next option relates to the BPC embedded model. And this is a little bit different paradigm here, because instead of being near live, and I say near live because in the standard model we're acquiring the data in the BPC embedded scenario, this is a live connection, which means that we're not staging the data within SAP Analytics Cloud. So we're using SAP Analytics Cloud really as a front end to a BPC embedded model. And then with that, you can do a number of planning functions or planning activities within SAP Analytics Cloud. We can run data sequences as well, and really kind of get some of the, the best of both worlds of being able to do your planning within SAP Analytics Cloud, but have the updates immediately occur within BPC embedded as well. So depending on what tool you're using, all the updates in this case are made in real time and synchronized for everyone at the same time. So we'll let everyone explore the exercise as it relates to data modeling. Please take a look at the videos within the help related to the BPC connection options. And I just wanted to kind of explain why you might use one type of connection versus another, as that isn't always so clear from our customers and partners as well. In the next session, we're going to look at planning functions. And now we'll take a look at the demo. So now we're going to look at a system, and we'll kind of go through the models that we've created as part of our planning activities. And the first thing I'd like to call out is certainly, I'll go through this probably every single time, is to really take advantage of the help. In this case, we've opened up the help. We're looking at some of the videos. If you really want to better understand some of these specific aspects that we're covering as part of the session, you can certainly dive into more detail looking at the videos. So if we look at some of the model connections, we can see that here as well, where we have a specific video on connecting to BPC here. So it'll take me just a little bit of time to find it, but certainly here it is. So it's right in the center. So if you wanted to go through a video watching someone go through the connection steps, you could do that. We're going to try to create a click-through as well to kind of allow you to step through the process and kind of experience that as well if you don't have access to a BPC system. So just looking at the models that we've included, we're going to go to Browse and Files, and then we want to
open up the files that we've saved. So as part of our exercise, what we've done is we've stored models in a public folder. We are encouraging everyone to make a copy of those public models and store them under your My Files directory. And this will mean that once you save your files, these models are yours. Any changes you make to the models will not affect other students. So the two models we have are our operating income and our employee expenses. If we look at our operating income model, one of the things that we'll see that we have a version which has the various planning versions that we're going to be using as part of this scenario. So we have actuals, we have some versions around allocations, creating an annual plan for 2020, and we have a forecast version here as well. And there's a good number of steps that we're going to be taking throughout the exercises to showcase some of the capabilities here as well. In addition to that, on the account dimension, as I had previously mentioned, we have the ability to set the exception aggregation as well as create account formulas, and we're going to be taking advantage of that as well. And I just want to kind of cover some of these capabilities. I think the examples in our exercise are pretty straightforward. We do have a little bit more complex examples as part of this data model, but we didn't include them in the exercise. But just taking a high-level look, here we have some price times volume type calculations, and it's very simple, where sales revenue equals a unit times price. And here we can, for North America in this case, we can look up a price and we know where it's stored. It's in this DRV0050, which is the stored price. And then we are looking at our entity, which is assigned to a pound sign, which means not assigned. So that's where we're storing the price in this case. And then if we want to do that calculation, we can simply do price times our units. One of the things that we did that's that I'd like to call out is we took advantage of some of the exception aggregation here as well, where we're now doing an aggregation where we're using sum. So we want to kind of multiply the two values together. When we set that up, we're going to use the exception aggregation by dimensions to say at what level we would like to create this calculation. So in this case, we would like to create it at the most detailed level, so all the members were selected in this case. But if we, for instance, had a price that didn't depend on time, so it was just one price, we could certainly deselect time here, and that calculation would occur at a higher level in this case. So there's a lot of power in calculations in using the exception aggregation. Some additional things that we can do is when we look at the accounts, is we see that there's an account type. I do want to call this out because this is critical in managing the sign of our values when we load them in. So from a P&L or operating income type scenario, we typically deal with income and expenses, and so we can set this flag to kind of manage that as well, so on how it treats the signs. So revenue is typically stored with a negative value, but then when we display it in a report, we typically want to view that as a positive value. At least hopefully it is positive. So that would be one case for income and expenses for P&L. If we're looking at a balance sheet, we would then have assets and liabilities, which are two standard modeling types as well. So the account type will dictate how things are managed from a sign perspective, and then we can set those. And certainly I recommend always setting the account type. I think it makes it easier to be very deliberate with your modeling than keeping that blank in this case. If you have some values that don't necessarily have are not really financial in nature, you can set them to non-financial as well. Some other items is the rate type, and this is really dictating the currency calculation. In this case, we have an average and a closing balance. So here we're looking at P&L, so we're going to be using the average rate. And that directly ties in with our currency model as well, where we can specify rates based on the rate type here. as well, and then we can have different rate types set accordingly. So certainly a lot of our basic formatting and everything else is set on the account dimension as well. So this is really going to drive, for the most part, your planning model. And very similarly, if you want to have hierarchies, you can maintain that here as well. I just selected the hierarchy tab. You can drag and drop and move things around to adjust your hierarchy here as needed. So a lot of power. For the most part, a lot of this, of what we do for creating planning models directly mirrors what we do from a business intelligence perspective as well. And that's really by design. So there's just a few little nuances, not really many, but once you start to explore them, you can see some of the additional capabilities we have from a planning perspective versus a business intelligence perspective. Some other things that I would like to call out here is as part of our exercise, we're going to be creating a number of kind of simpler dimension formulas. So this is one where we're doing a simple calculation for operating expense ratio, where we're looking at our units times our, not our units times our price, but our operating expenses divided by our net revenue to do this calculation. When we add a calculation, and from a planning perspective, we typically cannot plan on these cells. So in a report, they'll be grayed out and won't be available for data entry. One thing that we can do is we can create inverse formulas for this as well. So here we have for the operating profit, we say that we'd like that to be our operating income divided by our net revenue in this case, and then we can specify an inverse formula. And what the inverse formula does is it just tells the system that if we'd like to use this for planning, how we'd like to adjust the other members in the calculation so that everything kind of balances out. So in this case, you could plan on the operating profit percentage and as part of your planning activities. So the other model I would like to cover, and this is just, if you're not familiar with employee expense or headcount type modeling, just to provide some context for what we're doing here. This is a case where we're really trying to plan headcount, and then we're trying to, we'll create some data actions to do the employee expense type calculations. And we'll certainly cover that in a later section. But one of the things from a modeling perspective I did want to cover is that, from an account perspective, it's pretty straightforward. Our main account in this case, or main member, is going to be headcount in this case, and we have a lot of other fields for entering in drivers for driver-based calculations, and we have still some additional account members where we're storing those results of our calculations. So for the most part, this is pretty straightforward, but if you're not familiar with headcount planning, I did want to take a moment just to cover this movement dimension. So in the movement dimension here is really where we're tracking the movement of headcount. So we have headcount as a number, but really it's broken down into an opening balance. So what are we starting with? And then we're looking at the changes, which is our hiring and terminations. And that can be voluntary and involuntary. And then finally, we'll calculate a closing balance. So throughout any type of report that we create on our employee expense model, we're really going to be paying close attention to this movement to indicate, so we really track the type of headcount we want to use for calculations. So that's it for this section on our modeling, especially as it relates to planning. The next section we're going to be looking at, the next unit, is going to be looking at how to take advantage of some of the planning capabilities within a story. So thank you, and look forward to talking to you soon.